Very good. I want to hit one name.
All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Sunday night Emerging Revolutionary War Revelry. I am Dan Welch, a historian with Emerging Revolutionary War, and I also have with us this evening Mark Wilcox, a historian and blogger with Emerging Revolutionary War, as well as co-author of a new book in the ERW series on the Battle of Camden in South Carolina, all that can be expected, just out, with co-author Rob Orson. And tonight, Mark and our guest this evening have a powerful story to share with us about all the work being done down at Camden. And I don't want to give too much of it away. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mark.
Thanks so much, Dan. Hey guys, it's really great to be with you again for another Sunday night revelry. And yes, as Dan said, I'm one of the co-authors of a new book on the Battle of Camden, along with my friend Rob Orson. All that can be expected, the Battle of Camden and the British high tide in the South. Let's see if I can get it away from my face here. If this is a shameless plug, absolutely. But I think there's a lot of interest in learning more about Camden because you don't see a heck of a lot about this particular battle. And in my opinion, mainly because it wasn't a Patriot victory. It's not a Saratoga. It's not a Yorktown or whatnot. But it's an incredibly important battle because it really does mark the high tide of British success in the Southern American theater. And I think I can speak for my co-author Rob when I say that I've had an interest in this battle for probably the better part of 30 years, and mainly because of one thing. I mean, you've got two enemy armies about roughly 6 or 7 miles apart. The British Army occupying the small town of Camden, South Carolina, and in command of the British forces, all British forces there in the Southern Department, there is Lieutenant General Charles Earl Cornwallis. And at about 10 o'clock on the evening of August 15, 1780, Cornwallis is going to put his army on the road. These are seasoned British regulars, along with very well-trained provincials, loyalist militia, also well-trained, well-armed. And they're heading along the Great Wagon Road. Now, this is the artery that just comes down from Pennsylvania through Virginia and into the Carolinas. And they're heading north with the intention of attacking the Patriot American forces at Rugeley's Mills. Cornwallis says that without any question. He's going there to attack the Patriot forces. On the other side, at about 10 o'clock, and on that August 15th evening, the American commander Horatio Gates, Major General, he is the hero of Saratoga, or at least that's what he styles himself. And he never really cops to the fact that he might be thinking about attacking the British forces. He doesn't even know that Lord Cornwallis himself is in the town. Apparently his plan was to move closer to Camden, set up on the north bank of, we believe, maybe Sanders Creek, along that same road, the Great Wagon Road, at the only fordable spot there was to cross, and entice the British to attack him, to have to come across a fairly deep creek in a good defensible position. My hook on this was that at roughly 2:30 in the morning on August the 16th, 1780, the vanguards of these two armies bump into each other. Cavalry forces leading the way literally blunder into one another, and then for the next 15 minutes or so, all hell breaks loose. And then the forces withdraw, trying to figure out who it is in front of them out there, and start to deploy for battle. And it is a decisive British victory, no question about it, in every way, shape, and form. American militia forces, greenhorns from Virginia and Carolina, most of whom have never been in combat, will run away in the opening minutes of the battle. And this constitutes the Patriot left flank on left of the Great Wagon Road. And in minutes of the British 23rd and 33rd regiments of foot, the 23rd regiment is except going all the way back to Lexington and Concord, and seeing bayonets slanted and coming towards you was just enough to unnerve these poor guys. And a lot of them threw down their loaded muskets and ran. And that leaves the Continental forces. These are the American professional soldiers from Maryland, from Delaware, and they're standing fast, and they're given as good as they're getting. and you can't stand up to the whole army, and soon they're going to find themselves almost virtually surrounded and almost annihilated. This is a very short battle, maybe around an hour or so. And the British, in the style of the 18th century, whether they killed more Americans than they lost themselves, it doesn't matter. They held the ground. They were the victors. And they went about burying the dead. There were hundreds of patriot Continentals, militiamen. They were killed, wounded, and missing close to 3,000, over 300 British casualties. And so officers would receive, certainly in the British Army, special burial. But for the most part, the rank and file soldier is going to be dumped in a very hastily dug grave, very shallow. And for so many of these veterans, over 240 years, that's where they have laid in unmarked graves. And then about a year ago, in September of 2022, a project was begun, excavation, recovery, and at length, about 14 of these veterans would be discovered. Grave sites, their remains excavated and recovered, along with artifacts and so forth that are just incredibly interesting. And we are so lucky tonight to have the two gentlemen who were really the heart and the leadership of this organization. We have scholar, archaeologist James Legg and Dr. Stephen Smith, both from the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. Gentlemen, thank you again so much for joining us here tonight, and we're looking forward to hearing your story. And before we get started, would you mind taking just a moment or two and just give us a little background information on yourselves and maybe another project or two that you've maybe worked on in the past?
Well, Jim and I have worked on several projects on the American Revolution. We have worked at Snows Island, South Carolina. We've worked at Fort Mott, South Carolina. Jim has worked with private collectors at Hanging Rock. We've worked at Battle of Parker's or skirmish at Parker's Ferry. Oh my gosh, what else? Besides Camden. We've been on a lot of projects together over the last 20 years.
You did the entire Marion survey.
Yeah, we did a survey for the Francis Marion Trail Commission to look at 15 sites that were associated with campaigns of Francis Marion. Jim was part of that also. That was mainly me, whereas Jim had done Hanging Rock battlefield. 96. We forgot about 96. We've done
Yeah, our latest major project before the burial project. We excavated some small samples inside of a star fort and did a large metal detector survey inside and on the battlefield of Star Fort. And that was actually a fairly spectacular project. It was also spectacular, I thought, that the Park Service let Steve work. That Star Fort.
Yeah,
that's pretty unusual these days.
yeah, we didn't think we'd ever have the opportunity to work inside that fort, which is probably, well, it's the only two standing structures of the British evidence of the British Army. The other one being Fort Fairlawn down in Monk's Corner, being a square redoubt, and this, of course, was a star redoubt at 96.
And it's completely original.
Yes,
There's no WPA restoration or anything of the kind. It's a completely original Revolutionary War earthwork that, of course, was the subject of an intensive siege.
I just thought of another project we did a long time ago at Fort Balfour, which was another small fort. We were able to find remnants of it, pretty much taken out by the highway, but that's about the main ones.
Well, that was great. You guys were talking about, the site at 96. That was, I had an opportunity to go there a few years ago. I had been reading about, this location for 20 years, and it was so awesome to be there. And just a great job that you did there, just telling that story. And I'm really excited about the fact that the state of South Carolina is really doubling down on developing its Revolutionary War sites. I live in Richmond, Virginia. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. And you can probably guess that I had the Civil War pretty much sometimes shoved down my throat. And so being able to look at another period of history has just been great. In Virginia, we've got just history for three or four different centuries. There, you have to pick your century when you come to study history in Virginia. And I think that's so great with South Carolina, just developing so many of these sites from the Revolutionary War, and getting away from the Civil War to a certain extent.
Yeah, we've got the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust locally here that's really working with the 250th Commission, State Commission, to develop battlefields and interpretate programs for the 250th. We got the Liberty Trail that's being developed, also a part of the South Carolina Battleground Trust. We had a commission, Francis Marion Trail Commission, I mentioned that before. I think that's going to have some revival here in the next couple of years also. So yeah, we've had depending on who you talk to, there were anywhere from 200 to 250 skirmishes, battles, people yelling across creeks at each other, whatever else that happened during the American Revolution, and hangings and everything else that happened here in South Carolina. So it's a pretty big deal, and we've got a lot of support.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You know, you're exactly right, especially back there in the South Carolina backcountry. That was every bit as much a Civil War as anything that happened down there in the 1860s.
Right.
And so it's great really being able to, I don't want to say uncover it. We, a lot of these things have been known, but developing it even more. Well, guys, let's get to the Camden project. And again, Jim and I were talking just before we went live. I had a chance to be down in Camden in late September of 2022 with our mutual friend and my coworker, Bert Dunkerley. And I got a chance to witness some of the excavation work that was being done. And I just remember what a solemn solemnness there was among the workers, and just taking, finding these artifacts and finding the remains of these soldiers. How did this project even get started? What was the impetus for just getting started with this Camden excavation?
Can you take that? Well, I first started looking at Camden in the early 80s when I moved back to Columbia, and I was actually in graduate school, and I was originally looking at the Camden campaign as a thesis. So I looked at all of the readily available primary sources, and I'm actually kind of pleased to say that there haven't been a lot of great ones come along since. I think we talked about that in some email at one point.
Yeah.
But in the course of trying to figure out the Battle of Camden, it struck me that the battlefield wasn't telling us very much. There's nothing there but the DeKalb Monument and the National Register Monument. No interpretation at all. Again, this is in the early 80s. And nothing was happening. There really wasn't any indication of where and how the battle was fought on the modern terrain. And that situation really obtained until 1995, when the first effort came along to actually preserve the battlefield. It was paper company pine trees, several thousand acres in that area, owned by paper companies, commercial pine trees. And there was an effort by the Catawba Valley Land Preservation Trust to get a conservation easement out there. And they had no idea what to preserve. So I took my best shot. They said, get us about 400 acres on a map that we can work out a conservation easement with the paper company. And I wasn't really sure what I was doing, but we laid out 400 acres, and it turned out happily that my guesstimates were really good. We basically got the core battlefield in that original easement. But meanwhile, while all this is going on, I knew from collectors not only that the battlefield was reasonably well understood in a general way, because up here is where the major fighting was, but I also knew that burials had been found. And when Steve began to get grant money in 2001, between 2001 and 2008, he ended up with several pieces of Park Service grant money through the Palmetto Conservation Foundation. when he began to get money, one of the things we did was a collector survey. And I actually interviewed as many serious metal detector guys as I could get my hands on and looked at their collections. And if I could, I walked around the battlefield with them and recorded what information I could get. And in the course of doing this, we identified 8 burials that had been discovered by relic hunters. Unfortunately, in 1998, there had been a huge program of clear cutting by the paper company, including the easement. The conservation easement didn't have anything to do with harvesting pine trees. So the frame of reference in the woods for most of these burials was lost. The visual reference in the woods that these guys could have walked to in 1997 was destroyed. And to this day, 6 of those 8 burials have never been found again. It's possible that some of them will reemerge, but in any case, we knew that there were burials out there. And we also knew that there was enough material left in the way of artifacts that an intensive metal detecting program would tell us something. Would give us some kind of spatial information, a distribution that might match the primary sources and tell us where the valve is. So these 2 things were on our minds when we proceeded with the project, which again was in the early part of the 2000s. It was the most intensive part of it initially. So we did this metal detecting program, we did the collector interviews, and we knew that there were burials there. And I had wanted all along for decades to address these burials with excavation and proper reburial. But it just didn't happen at that time. Now we did make an effort in 2006 to confirm some of these lost burials. We found 2 of them, and they ended up being 2 of the 7 locations that we excavated in September. So,
Okay, and hey, let's go back to very quickly, the 1980s. I know a lot of relic hunters were there. Was any of the battlefield property preserved at that point, or was it all private property at that point?
There was a 6-acre tract owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution, immediately around and behind the DeKalb mine, and that was it. The rest of it was pine plantation. So it was subject to development or anything else, completely unprotected.
How many acres have been preserved at this moment?
Just shy of 800, including the entire core battlefield. So we're pretty pleased with the degree of preservation. We need some additional tracks along the highway for green spacing and that sort of thing, particularly from both north and south on the highway. We could use some additional wooded tracks for the landscape, but the core battlefield is completely preserved.
And who owns the battlefield? Who owns it? Because it's not National Park Service, right?
No, the original 2 large tracts that were preserved by Catawba Valley and ultimately purchased by Palmetto Conservation Foundation that include the core battlefield. Those tracts, which must have been 500 acres, something like that. Those tracts are now owned and managed by the Historic Camden Foundation. More recently, the South Carolina Battleground Trust, with funds from the ABT, the American Battlefield Trust, purchased a large tract to the north on the west side of the highway, which significantly covers a big chunk of the retreat landscape. The Americans who survived and escaped retreated to the northwest, and this includes a big chunk of that. They still own that, but the entire battlefield is managed by Historic Camden. So it's all under one roof in terms of management.
That's great. That's great to hear. So September of 2022, how did this get started? I mean, as far as this particular dig, we've gotten up to that point now. And was it still considered to be a small scale operation that grew, or had you already at that point you guys decided to expand to include other archaeologists and organizations?
Well,
and
it was-
what organizations were involved?
It was going to start out small.
Yeah.
The South Carolina Battleground Trust funded the project, and they were very interested in when they talked to Jim, finding out that these burials were just below the surface. And one of the things we learned when we were excavating was, in fact, one of them was partially above the surface. His femurs were sticking up out of the ground, but we couldn't see that in the dirt and that sort of thing while you're walking around. But when we started excavating, so there were these really shallow burials, and they wanted to get them preserved. And Jim's vision had been to find these burials that we knew about, excavate them, and then rebury them on the battlefield deeply so they never would be disturbed again.
In the same location.
In the same location. And that was what the Battleground Trust also wanted. So the idea was they contracted with us. Yes, it was me and Jim. We had a forensic anthropologist from the Department of Anthropology with us in the initial idea. And we were going to go out there and collect these 6, which was a small project. What happened was it got larger. We can go into that, but we also had so many people who were interested in volunteering, professional archaeologists.
Professional volunteer.
We didn't want a real, popular sort of public dig going on there. We wanted to, as you said, we wanted to honor these people and treat them with respect. But the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources came in and offered us excellent work by archaeologists and also some heavy equipment that we needed to clear out areas. We also had Dr. Bill Stevens and Dr. Maddie Atwell, who's now with the Richland County Coroner's Office, who came in and ended up doing most, if not all, of the recovery of the burials. Once the methodology was for the archaeologists to open up formal archaeological units over the burials where we knew they were. And then once we had exposed them, bring in the forensic team to actually do the recovery of the bones and take them to the Richland County Coroner's Office. And they volunteered their time. We couldn't have done it without either one of those organizations. Let's put it that way.
They're both archaeologists.
And they're, yeah, by the way, they're both trained archaeologists, but they're also forensic anthropologists, so they know the bones and what we're looking at, and they helped us discern when we had these multiple burials in a small area. They were invaluable in discerning who was where and who belonged to who in terms of the remains. So it turned out to be a big team effort. And like I said, we could not have done it without their help. Because as you know, some of these burials we thought were 1 end up being, in one case, 5. So we needed that sort of backup.
Yeah, I should point out, if we go back to the early 2000s, we had 2 graves confirmed. We had 2 collector graves that had been confirmed. When we finally did the project with last September, we had 5 for certain and another that we thought we could relocate. The additional graves were ones that we had found during the pandemic, metal detecting. We had, particularly myself, I had very little to do when the Institute closed down. And I spent a huge amount of time on the battlefield doing formal metal detector coverage. And Steve was out there a lot as well. And we found a total of 3 new graves during that process. So we had a total of either 5 or 6 graves in the contract when we began. We ultimately ended up with 7 graves and 14 individuals scattered in those 7 graves. So that accounts for the disparity in various numbers. But we have 14 individuals.
And I remember being down there, I don't want to say secrecy, but I mean, clearly it would have been a good idea to make it known to the public. Did you ever have any problems with people passing through, people coming in and trampling, on these sites?
We had
One day, some guys from the Park Service showed up. I don't know.
yeah, that was really a thing,
It was bird.
No, we didn't make any announcement of it. In fact, the Battleground Trust and Historic Camden Foundation officially closed the park. And we had volunteer security people at night who were there all night long, and of course, when they volunteered, this was a 2-week project, no problem. And then it turned out to be a 2-month project. So these group of guys really, they volunteered, they were out there every evening.
10 weeks.
10 weeks. And so, we had people come who found out about it, and we never had any real issue, just telling people that, you can't go any farther. There was a lot of people who became involved simply because you can't keep a secret like that.
Sure.
They came out, and we had, I think we had at least one. The battlefield is often visited by local, we have military bases around. And we've been out there on a number of occasions, and up will roll a van or something, and out will come a bunch of soldiers on a staff ride. And so I think we had some of those show up during at least one organization, right? We had some.
The best one was a group from the Special Warfare Warrant Officers School, who of course are people who often just tell you their first names. And they came down from Fort Bragg, and that was probably the best tour I've ever given. Those guys were amazing. And they brought a class back a week later. So that was an exception, and I was willing to make exceptions to the no access secrecy thing for groups that didn't want to just come out and look at skeletons laying in the ground.
Right.
When you have an excavation that involves human remains, and this is a general thing in archaeology, you really don't want the general public just wandering out and gazing at the human remains. Not only is it a security issue, but there are, particularly in the last few years, it's become an ethical issue. You don't simply display people laying in the ground for the public to appreciate. So we were sensitive to that. And ironically, we actually got a little bit of criticism from the larger archaeological community for not involving the community in the project. So we were, like, well, which do you want? Do you want sensitivity to the dead, or do you want, the public program? And we chose the secrecy end of things, frankly. So,
Yeah, we had pushback from some people who just felt we shouldn't even touch these individuals, but when they were so close to the surface, we felt that it was best to get them in the ground.
Well, see, what was their argument about that? They didn't want you to mess with disturb the grave sites, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
what was?
Right. People, I I understand that they're buried, leave them alone. It wasn't ever made in a lot of the announcements, the media announcements, it wasn't made abundantly clear that these people were practically on the surface, and they were subject to any sort of surface disturbance, trees falling over,
including more relic.
including relic hunting. There's just, we don't have 24-hour security out there. The National Park Service does not have rangers out there, even today, walking this battlefield and making sure people are doing the proper thing. So there was that, and there's been, a long period of time in which this battlefield has not been treated as a sacred place, and by this project hopefully has gotten the public to realize we have a battlefield here. We have a sacred ground. It needs to be respected. And that was kind of a secondary goal for us. And I think a lot of people got the message.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, the events that you all had back in April, you know, really presented that message that this truly is hallowed ground and it needs to be treated as such. And, you know, I think for all that were in attendance over that weekend, that messaging really hit home. And I tend to think, or at least I'm hopeful to think, that that message will continue to spread. But for viewers this evening that are joining us, we've got a fascinating discussion tonight about the Camden graves that were located and the reburial process of those remains, joined with some of the archaeologists that were involved in that project, as well as historian and ERW blogger Mark Wilcox, who is the co-author of the latest book in the Emerging Revolutionary War series on the Battle of Camden, All That Can Be Expected. I want to get you guys back in the conversation, but I just want to let the folks know that are joining us this evening, if you have any questions, drop them down in that comment section, and we'd love to get those to our guests this evening. So with that, Mark, take us back into the discussion.
Thanks so much, Dan. Hey, you're really good at that, by the way. Really smooth, man. Well, guys, let's, the project has started. Talk to us about these 7 grave features. Talk to us about what was found, what was excavated in terms of human remains, certainly. And also there were artifacts that were found that helped identify perhaps who these particular individuals fought for, which side they were on.
Go ahead.
I guess we have time. Well, yeah, indeed, we had a total of 7 grave features, and it ended up being 14 individuals. We had no previous notion that it would be like that. I can't say it was a huge surprise, because one thing I've always wondered is why there aren't mass burials out there, like a trench with 20 or 30 individuals. We didn't see that, but as Steve mentioned, we did have one burial that had 5 individuals in it. There were 2 outliers. One being the enlisted soldier from the 71st Regiment of Foot, Fraser's Highlanders, and the other being the unidentified Native American individual who was over on the far American right. The Highlander was the only British soldier that we excavated, and he was very different in that he was in a fairly formal European grave with his hands over his waist, laid out decently by somebody who cared about him when they laid him out. He was wearing his regimental coat, his sword belt, his enlisted sword belt was not around his shoulders, but it was thrown on the burial before he was backfilled. And his cartridge box was actually thrown in the hole about halfway up in the process of filling the grave. And he was about 2.5 feet deep, which doesn't sound like much, but compared to these other individuals, it was a very decent grave. That individual, I believe there were 9 enlisted men from the 71st killed that day. The 71st was in reserve until the very end of the battle. So this was a very unlucky individual. He died down in the vicinity of where Smallwood's line had probably retreated to on the American left at the close of the battle. So this guy probably died at about the time the Americans were giving way and breaking in all directions. This guy was hit. He was unfortunate. He did not have any evidence of wounds, except that his skull was badly fractured in a way that Bill Stevens suggested would not have happened from soil pressure or whatever. Bill was of the opinion that even though the individual was not in good condition physically, the bones are not in good condition, that he'd probably been had his skull smashed in hand-to-hand combat of some kind. So no gunshot wound there. If he was bayoneted, we don't know it because we had no evidence on the bones. But there he was, and It's entirely possible that the other 67 British killed that day are, they simply aren't showing up because they are buried decently. If that cartridge box had not been thrown into that grave during backfilling, nobody with a metal detector would have ever found that individual. He was found, as I said, back in 81 or 82. He was one of the original collector graves.
And was his gravesite located, was that on the extreme American right as well, or was it on the left? Because there were two
On the
battalions
left.
in 71st.
It's
Okay.
on the left, so he was with the battalion that was on the right side of the road, apparently, on the British right side of the road. He's very close to the DeKalb line. If you saw a little British flag out there when you were there, that's him. The other outlier is the Native American. He was found by collectors back in the early 80s, I believe, maybe mid 80s. And they told me, two different individuals who, were not in collusion, told me that the individual had nothing on him but a set of civilian coat or vest buttons. So there were no military diagnostic artifacts on this individual. And there was no gunshot evidence. But he was thrown face down into a very shallow grave in a very coarse fashion. His limbs were all over the place, and he was face down. So we don't have any evidence of who he was. Now, given his location on the battlefield, and given that all the Continentals appeared to have been wearing regular Continental uniforms, I speculated that he was a loyalist militia because they were on that end of the battlefield. So he could be a North Carolina Native American who was with Bryan's Corps, for example, or maybe even the Royal North Carolinians, who was killed that day. And he was somebody who was not in a military coat. So he's completely unknown. Now, of course, because he's Native American and because he's under the jurisdiction of Native American authorities at this point, they're able to say, you may not do any sampling of any kind with this individual. They were okay with our handling the burial, so long as we can agree with whatever they want to do at the end in terms of his final disposition. But they said everything's great except you cannot sample. So we can't do DNA or isotopic studies, either or both of which might have said this individual is probably a North Carolinian, or this individual might be Iroquoian, or somebody else who might have been in the Maryland League, or the Maryland Brigade. So we'll never know. I was of the opinion that we should just call him a soldier of the Revolution. But my speculation about him being one of Bryan's men has led to his basically his loyalist ID.
We should also clarify that when this guy was, again, very shallow, just underneath the grass, take the sod off, and there it was. And we had no clue that this was a Native American at the time. So we removed him, took him to the Richland County Coroner's office, and I think I was in the field, and Jim was in the field too at the time that we got a call from the coroner's office. Bill Stevens said, this guy's got shovel-shaped incisors, and that is a trait that is associated with Asiatic peoples. So we immediately quit what we were doing, and we contacted two tribes, local tribes, who told us not to do any other further work. And now we are in the process of what's called the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, which is a federal law pertaining to collections, primarily on federal collections. However, it's just the right thing to do to go ahead and and turn this over to Native Americans. So what we're in the process of doing now is notifying all tribes who may have an interest. And they'll be getting a letter. And if they have an interest, they will contact us and we will go through the process of determining which among the many tribes who might be involved, which one will act as the primary tribe, which will decide how this person will be reburied, reinterred, and where he will be reinterred. It's a long process.
So I think this is a good time for one of the questions that we had come in, as you've talked a little bit about the excavation process, and in particular the soldier from the 71st Foot with the cartridge box. One of the questions is where are the artifacts being stored, and will they be displayed in the future?
Hey, Dan, that's one of my questions, doggone it. Everybody's jumping ahead of us. No, yeah, that's absolutely interesting.
Okay.
Where are they being displayed, or will they be displayed for the public?
Okay, to begin with, I should say most of what we have in the way of artifact data is not much to look at. Most of what we have are hundreds, actually close to 3,000 little Ziploc bags, almost all of which have a small piece of lead. And that is most of our data. If you look at our distributional data, that's largely what it is. It's musket balls, buckshot, and a few other small artifacts. We're not finding accoutrement plates and swords and big chunks of muskets and bayonets and whatever. We're finding a lot of small ammunition evidence for this. So it's not terribly good exhibit material, but basically the project in terms of the collection can be divided into a couple of periods. The period up to 2009, when we had support from the Palmetto Conservation Foundation. Their battlefield person directed us to make sure that the collection that resulted from the work during that period end up in Camden. And that's not normally what we would have done. Normally, the Institute has its own curatorial facility. And normally when we go out and do a project, the collections that are generated end up in state curation. Which is a cumbersome thing, but at least it guarantees that in perpetuity, the collection will be intact. Now, happily, the Camden Archives and the Historical Library in downtown Camden, which is a county function, by the way, they had recently begun work to do a completely modern curatorial facility in the lower level of their building. If you're in Camden the next time, go check that out and have a look. It's an absolutely beautiful curatorial facility with sliding curation shelves and climate control and qualified people. And so it's all we could ask for in terms of a curation facility. And that's where the collection went in 2009, everything we had up to that time. And that included, by the way, some of the material that was donated to us. 3 different collectors among the 12 or 13 who we interviewed donated their collections. And everything that was removed from the 71st burial in the early 80s is in that collection.
Wow.
So we have 100% of the material from that burial in 2 other collections. So yeah, that material is at archives. It's at the Camden Archives.
And part of our book, I got a chance to write an appendix on the Camden project and on your findings. Gentlemen, you were so generous and with your time and energies that really helped with that. And Jim, you were so great to share with us a couple of really good photographs of some of the pewter buttons, the 71st button, the USA buttons that were indicative of the Continental regimental jacket and so forth. And we have given you full credit as I promised, but yeah, we have those photographs in the book as well. So you can get
I was able to look at your book for about 5 minutes the other day up at Historic Camden.
Well, that was
A copy, it said, have you
5
seen?
minutes longer than I thought you were going to, Jim, so thank you for that.
It looks great.
Well, and that's a great segue to a follow-up question that we had was, you know, will there be a published report on the dig?
Oh,
And
yeah.
as Mark said, you know, that there's a small narrative in the appendix of his work and with his co-author Rob Orson. But you know, will there be a published report on the dig that outlines this story? You know, the question coming in is saying that this is a fascinating story. Will we be able to read more about it?
Well, there's two things there. Yes, we will do a report. There'll probably be several reports because we are attempting, I shouldn't say we are attempting to do DNA analysis. That's going to take a long time. Of course, there's always the ideal that maybe someday we could identify one of these soldiers as to, you know, who they might be as individuals. But that's going to take a lot of time. And so we will have a sort of a technical report that describes everything. There'll be genetics and DNA studies coming out over the next couple of years. Hopefully Jim and I will live long enough to do a competing book with Mark on the Battle of Camden. So we'll be doing that. And I wanted to also clarify that the artifacts that came out of the burials, most of the things that we used to identify were buttons. They were pewter and they were not in good shape. So Jim has been spending a considerable amount of time trying to preserve some of those artifacts, and at least enough to be able to consolidate them. Somewhat will not ever be consolidated. They came out in fragments. Pewter doesn't do well in soils.
Yeah, Mark, the two buttons that I sent you images of were the best examples of the 71st in the USA. For the most part, it was a process of isolating button fragments in the burials in the field. And we would scoop up dirt, put it in a container with a piece plotted provenience. And in the following couple of months after we got out of the field, I washed out every one of those containers and went through all those little fragments. The effort was not to try to restore those buttons. The effort was to make certain that there was nothing else going on there. In other words, I didn't want to see on what I thought was a continental burial, a British button. So I was looking for fragments large enough to say, well, there's the tail of the S from a USA button. And so there's a confirmation that this is a USA button. These things are just completely annihilated. Many of them, by the time I was able to actually look at them, were just a thimbleful of gray, crusty stuff with no diagnostic elements. Now, happily, American buttons and British uniform buttons are completely different in terms of construction. So even with no detail at all on the face, a British uniform button sticks out because it has an iron wire loop cast into the back of the button. And we saw none of those except in the 71st burial. None at all. So
well, I think we caught up with our questions, and there's one kind of big one that I'll save to the end, but I want to get back to Mark and kind of continue your narrative of after the excavations had been made and some of the work had been done at the county coroner's office. So Mark, I want to hand it back over to you to kind of guide that narrative forward.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So yeah, the field project is I guess done. And the idea at that point was to give these veterans a proper burial or reburial, if you will. And I'd like, how much were you involved, you two gentlemen, with the Camden Re-Burial Project, which very quickly, there was a weekend, the latter part of April past 2023, where South Carolina state dignitaries, including the state's governor, came for a really wonderful celebration and commemoration. Dan and I were both there for the event. And were you involved with the planning, or was that just out of your hands and the other organizations took that and ran with it?
That was out of our hands.
Yeah.
That was Doug Bostic and the local history community who put that whole thing together. That whole amazing 3-day thing was largely Doug Bostic's operation overlord. I don't know how he did it in the time that he did it, but
Yeah, there's another gentleman working with him, Rick Wise, who's a local historian, former military, who works with the South Carolina Battleground Trust, gives him a lot of time. And he was sort of one of the local logistics guys and getting all the little parts put together. So those two, and another gentleman by the name of David Brewer was involved. And of course, Charles Baxley was involved.
Charles was pretty ill at the time.
Yeah, Charles did what he could do. And of course, Historic Camden Foundation under Carrie Briggs did a lot. There were lots of reenactors at the ceremonies. We don't know all of their names and who they were. The British consulate came and they brought 6. Was it 6? I think it was 6.
Yeah. The
Honor Guard
from the Royal Scottish Regiment.
from the Royal Scottish Regiment. They were there. They were fantastic to work with. But that whole thing was pretty much, we were in the background at that point.
Yeah, that was.
We were in the audience.
I occasionally tried to interject an opinion, but I wasn't really part of it. Steve was still a part of it because Steve was the administrator of the contract for the thing. So Steve was still dealing with Doug and so forth in terms of the actual project that the Institute did. But I really kind of left the project in terms of anybody being interested, in my opinion, after the end of November.
Gotcha. Well, I remember we came down and my co-author Rob Orson and Dan were already in South Carolina, and we met them. My wife Kimberly came with us, and she is not a history lover at all. She's a math and science person. And God bless her. She was so happy to come down there. I was glad to be able to share that with her. She'd never been to Camden. But I remember on that Friday night, the veterans were lying in state in the Kershaw House. They're part of the historic Camden Revolutionary War site. And Dan, we were talking about it before we went live. Just what a solemn, what a unbelievably moving experience that was. I think for both of us, just walking through, it was candlelit, a full, military, U.S. military presence there, standing guard, along with reenactors, living historians, actually playing a similar role. And just how solemn that was. Just walking through, and these were specially made coffins right there at the historic Camden.
Yeah, there was a gentleman there who built the coffins. There was a blacksmith who forged the nails using the proper techniques to put the coffins together. There was a lot of little details that hopefully a lot of people were able to appreciate. But it was a fantastic event.
Yeah, Mark and I is working at Civil War battlefields. Most recently had went through the sesquicentennial experience with a lot of very solemn commemorations for those events. And I've been to a lot of historic sites, but the efforts that were done based upon the project that you guys worked on was an experience that I think those in attendance will never forget. Speaking for myself, it was very powerful.
For your audience, you might let them know that if they Google Camden burials, they'll come up with a website which has the funeral, that Friday night event at Historic Camden.
Our lectures on it.
Our lectures on it. We did a lecture with Maddie and Bill on Wednesday night.
Yeah, a panel.
Thursday night.
3 lectures on Thursday night.
So there's like 3-hour-long presentations there that they can watch. There's a lot more information, pictures, that sort of thing, that they can just look at anytime.
Fantastic. Well, Mark, I know we're getting close to the end here. I got this one kind of loaded question. Was there anything that you wanted to get through, Mark, before we get to the end?
Fire away, Dan.
So the question that I've kind of been holding off that we had come in from Dave was, why were the men not reburied on the battlefield, but rather in Camden? I think that's a pretty
Oh, boy.
controversial question in the.
We don't have another hour, do we?
You guys not gonna get in trouble for answering this, right?
I could provide the short version
Yeah,
without too much steam.
okay. Yeah, I'll let Jim handle that. Jim says he wants to handle that.
Yeah, as you can tell, it's a very controversial topic, I think, within the Revolutionary War history community and the archaeology
yeah,
community
that's
and many
kind
different
of-
circles.
And the original plan was for the veterans to go back and be reburied where they were found, correct?
Exactly.
Same locations, same angles, everything else.
Let's just, the brief version would be that the US Army was invited to participate. And as a result of that, they eventually became in control of the American remains. And they were reburied after considerable negotiation. They did not want them at the Camden battlefield. They wanted them at Fort Jackson. There was a lot of negotiation, and the compromise was to bury them at Camden, near the historic Camden Foundation at a place called the Quaker Cemetery.
Which is an 18th century, originally an 18th century cemetery.
Right.
Yeah. Very, very briefly.
That's the clean version.
Yeah, very, very briefly. Doug Bostic went to a lot of trouble to try to get the old guard from Arlington involved in this. As we know, he was successful. But at some point in March, the people from Arlington and a federal archaeologist began getting in touch with Steve and I over and over again, actually pretty redundantly, and wanted to know what evidence we could provide that these 12 individuals were indeed American soldiers. Were they indeed Continentals and not something else? And their explanation was that they had to know that in order to spend taxpayers' money on the old guard coming to Camden, because they had to have American soldiers involved. So Steve and I went to a huge amount of trouble to try to prove to these guys, basically forensically, that we had 12 Americans. And finally, they came down. They actually came down and looked at our physical evidence. And they were satisfied that indeed we had 12 Continental soldiers out of our 15. Then just about a week before the event, the Army got in touch and said, you have 12 US soldiers and they are therefore under our jurisdiction and you cannot bury them. And I learned that 2 days before the 20th, that would have been the 18th, when I was waiting to join the cemetery backhoe guys to dig the 7 graves. I wondered why I hadn't heard from them, and Doug Bostic called me up and said, we aren't going to be digging in the graves. And so that's how that went. Now, of course, it was too late to do anything about the events. And I'd be curious to know actually what knowledge there was of the state of affairs on the 22nd among visitors like yourselves. What did you learn about what was happening?
I think for my first time being there, thanks to Mark and Rob Orson and others, that had been down there with you guys and had really been digging into the story over the last couple of years, that I think that had already kind of filtered through the community that it was going to be a ceremony, but there wouldn't be any reburials because of the Army's involvement. And I think it was one of those, and Mark, maybe I read the crowd wrong, but I think it was kind of an understood but not spoken.
Yeah, I wondered.
Yeah.
Because we didn't learn about it until 4 days before the event. I mean, the big event.
Yeah, it was the week, because I was doing an interview with another group and at Camden, and after that I thought, well, I'm here, I might as well run out because I know that they're digging the graves. And I came out there and there was nobody at the battlefield. That's how I found out about it.
And we also were not aware that the Army was actually seizing the individuals at the end of the ceremony. I don't know how long y'all stood around afterward, but after the crowd pretty much broke up,
The
There were-
funeral limos came in.
Right, there were
Yeah, we stayed for that. Yeah.
rented hearses showed up, and they had been hired by the Army. And they effectively seized those 12 sets of remains and took them off to a undisclosed location, as the Army likes to say. So
Wow.
that's that. And
Well, we
thereafter,
had,
they called the shots. And originally, they had said, maybe we'll have a cemetery on that field, not individual graves, but maybe we can have a federal plot for
Yeah,
Camden
that's-
on the ballot.
I've heard that as well.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they discarded that as well. But, you know, I had nothing to do with any of this, and neither did Steve. We were not involved in these conversations.
Guys, looks like we're about out of time. I just want to say that because of this project, because of your efforts, I mean, there are 14 individuals who for over 240 years were lying in unmarked graves. And hardly anyone outside of Camden knew they were there. And now you've got individuals who have been put to rest with dignity in marked spots. And as someone who has studied many battles and many different wars, that just touches my heart. It means a great deal to me. So thank you so much for your efforts.
Appreciate that.
in
Sure,
this
thank
project.
you.
absolutely.
Dan, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining us again this evening for our Emerging Revolutionary War Sunday evening revelry. A great topic and conversation this evening, and we can't thank you guys enough for all of your efforts that you've done down at Camden over the years. Join us again in just 2 weeks on October the 15th for our next ERW revelry, and it sounds like we may have to have you guys on again. There's a lot of interest in the discussion this evening, and I think there's a lot more that our folks are interested in learning from you all. And thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks for our next installment. So for Emerging Revolutionary War, I'm Dan Welch, and take care. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Good evening.